Should children be banned from social media? Should the government be able to force you into jury duty? And is Christ the King an anti-Semitic trope? We look into these issues and more on this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. This is the show where we go through the internet and find the most interesting takes and talk about what's good and what's bad about them. My name is Donald, and I'm here with my co-host Britt. Before we get started, a reminder, like, share, subscribe, helps us out a ton. If you just take a moment to do that, it goes a long way. And you can follow us on socials at Good Take, Bad Take Pod on Instagram, Good Bad Take Pod on Twitter and YouTube. Without further ado, we'll get into the takes. So I wanted to start this podcast off with sort of an optimistic, happy, hopeful one, because sometimes it feels like even our good takes are good takes about bad things in the world. And this is just a positive, good take. I'm spoiling it because I don't see how you could read this and see it, but exploring why it's good and the good messages behind it, I thought would be worthwhile. So this comes from Spike Cohen, and he tweets, "On this night 10 years ago, the ER doctors told me that I probably have multiple sclerosis. Parentheses, they were right. But that was just the beginning of my problems. I was nearly 100 pounds overweight. My blood pressure, heart rate, blood oxygen, blood sugar, cholesterol, you name it, it was bad. I'd get winded walking upstairs at 31 years old. But worst of all, I was also severely depressed and felt like my life had no meaning. And all of this had started long before I started suffering from MS. Had I not been diagnosed, I probably would have kept putting off doing the health thing. I would have kept focusing on my business and told myself that I'd deal with my health later. I'd probably be dead right now. But facing this potentially disabling illness forced me to take my health seriously. Fast forward to today, I'm at my ideal weight, all my vitals are perfect, and I'm the most energetic I've been in my entire adult life. I work out daily and travel the country speaking and running my nonprofit. More importantly, I'm happy and filled with purpose, and every day keeps getting better. In retrospect, MS has been one of the greatest blessings I've ever been given. I say all of this to say this. If I can do it, you can do it. I'm going to tell you what I wish I could go back and tell myself in 2014. I know things seem impossible right now, but you've got this. Now let's get to work." All right. And then there's a photo for any video watchers here of him in 2014 versus 2024, which is a marked difference. All right. Let's talk about this take.
Yeah, it's great, man. And I mean, this is the type of attitude you have to have. I guess anyone has to have that is in a bad position and wants their life to get better. You know, not that we're big fans of Andrew Tate or anything like that on this show, but I remember he had one tweet exchange that I found really funny, because someone was saying something like, they're like, "Well, I'm just too overweight and I can't, I just don't have the willpower to like get back in shape or get healthy." And Andrew Tate's like, "Okay, so you don't have the willpower. Like, I guess you're going to die then." And that's kind of like what it comes down to with a lot of these things is that it's like, okay, like if you keep making excuses, eventually you end up at the very end of it all. And it's like, well, I guess that there's no more excuses to be made. There's only just the consequences to be paid. And, Spike's take is a little bit more of a positive spin on that, right? It's like, hey, I had this awful thing happen to me. And because I realized like I was in such a bad position, I needed to make changes. And that was the only way to get better. Like I'm actually thankful for the thing that was difficult because it helped me realize something. And I think you can only get to that point of being thankful for things that are awful when you decide that, like, hey, I'm not going to let my weaker self take advantage of myself, and I'm going to choose to press on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and that's the important perspective for not only personal issues, but even the big, things that feel like they're out of our control, right? And that's one of the things I actually really like about this is, especially if you're either conservative or maybe you don't identify conservative, but you're sort of in the liberty sphere of politics, it can feel like the entire structures are set up against you and that it's impossible. But you can't go into the defeatist mentality. In Spike's case here, obviously he was talking about personal life or death. And in many cases, for us, it feels like either the not necessarily the country in terms of the structure of government, but the society we live in, and maybe the standard of living that we're used to, and those kinds of things can feel like it's life or death in that sense. And so many of the conservative or libertarian types, the response is doomerism. It's like, all right, well, we got to pack up and leave, move to a freer state, or bury your head in the sand. And I think that you do that at your own peril. And things that can seem impossible, they happen all the time in history. The great example that Michael Malice will bring up is, if you told someone even 20 years or 50 years before the institution of slavery was abolished in the West, that would have seemed impossible, and yet it happened. You talk to someone 20 years before the Berlin Wall falls, it would have seemed impossible. The dissolution of the USSR, all these things. And so when you put those into perspective, it really does show that we can't afford to have a doomerous, everything is terrible, black pilled mentality. Even if things are getting hard and seem like it's going to get worse before it gets better, when you have something on the line, in Spike's case here, he's talking about a very personal thing, which was, self improvement in his own health. For us, it's oftentimes it's having a family and having kids and wanting them to live in a society where they are going to be free. These things force you. You don't have a choice. You don't get to be depressed and despondent and running away from these problems. And I think that this is just a very positive spin on the kinds of things where sometimes those really bad things in the short term can spur you on to greater things, that in the face of adversity you really do rise to the challenge. And so even though MS is a terrible, debilitating disease, he used that as the catalyst to improve his life, which is incredible. And so maybe that's the same thing here. It's the cycle of hard times create strong men. Maybe that's where we're at in our culture, and we need people to rise to the occasion to make sure that we get through the hard times. And whether that's in the near short term, then maybe it is, but we need to be ready for that and not just give up and say, oh, we're resigned to collapse and nothing ever will come out of that.
Yeah, the in college, I one of I had to help write a paper for one of my friends because they didn't want to read a book, and the book that they had to read, I'm not going to sell them out here, so that's why I was trying to not give too much of the background on it. But the book, they're a psych major, and they were assigned to write a summary on a book called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And Viktor Frankl survived the Nazi concentration camps, and he was also like a psychologist. And one of his big takeaways from it, at least, was like looking at it from a psychologist perspective. And he was like, yeah, the prisoners that actually made it through were not the strongest or the most well fit or even the healthiest, but they were the prisoners that had some sort of purpose in their life beyond that, existed outside of the camps and outside of what was like right in front of them, that they grab onto, and that would transform their ability to like go through things that no one else could ever survive. And I just always have found that like whole book really, really inspiring and inspirational and encouraging. And I see a lot of that in this quote by Spike. So I think it's just overall a great and awesome take, and good job finding it.
Yeah, no, I was really happy to see it, and hopefully that's an inspiring start to the rest of our takes here. So the next take that we are going to tackle here is, well, it's not really so much a take as it is an action, which is an article from Dexerto that reads, Florida will ban anyone under 14 owning a social media account from January 2025, deleting existing accounts. The bill was signed today by Governor DeSantis. All right. Banning social media for minors. What's the call?
And it's got a picture of him doing his best attempt at a smile. That's kind of come to define him. This is a terrible thing to do. What sucks about these types of things and the government being involved is that like I might agree that like for my personal children, when they reach the age of 14 or before the age of 14 or even till the age of 18, being like, hey, in my own household, right? Like I'm not going to encourage or allow you to have a social media, or I'm going to limit it or have some sort of parameters around that. But that is not the job of the government to go about limiting. And as usual, like the effectiveness of like there's the spirit of the law. So let's just say like the intended spirit of this is to like, oh, well, it's polluting people's hearts and minds, and we don't want our youth growing up with this filth, and it's the job of the government to, enforce this. It's like, well, the stated intent can be drastically affected by who is actually doing the enforcement. Like if it's parents and like their actual communities and churches and as close as it is to the people that actually have a word in the kids' lives that are enforcing it, the chance that you're going to actually have a better, more moral society and moral, teenagers and youth is a lot higher. But if it's the government, The only type of enforcement that can be done by the government is them enforcing this upon the companies that administer this. And what that's going to do is just make it harder for people that are able to actually access these things to do it. It's going to put in, place things where it's like, hey, just tell us what your age is before you sign up. And it's like, yeah, as if any youth has never ever lied about their age. Like I remember MySpace, I think had had an age limit of 16 years old before you could use it. I had a MySpace when I was 16, maybe it was 13. Yeah, I think it must have been 13. So I was 13 and I had a MySpace because I felt okay, like marking that I was born in 1993 and I could have a MySpace. But my brother Jack, like I was drastically offended when I realized that he also had a MySpace and he had just picked a date that was at the same age as I was, right? To say that he was 13 years old. So, not only is this going to just make things harder for all the people that should be and can be using this, it doesn't even satisfy the intent and the spirit of the law that it claims to try and support.
Yeah. Now, I will start with the caveat that this particular bill that was signed, from my understanding, and I have skimmed the bill text, but I'm not a lawyer and I haven't read it fully in depth, and I haven't been able to see all of the articles and analysis yet from groups that I trust. But I followed similar bills. There was an earlier, I think it may have been this bill with a different revision, or it may have been a different bill in Florida. Some bills in places, I think like Utah maybe had one, but this is a market improvement from some of those, in that the original version of this bill would have required verification with government ID. And that would have been a disaster for a lot of reasons, namely privacy of your data, security of your data. Assuming that the social media sites are even willing to not sell you out to the government, the security factor alone of giving something like your government ID to any social media site that they deem under this is a bad practice. So this does not require that. However, you then run into the awkward tension of the fact that you are putting this pressure on the companies like Facebook or other social media sites to use. I think the two terms they use in there are um, anonymous age verification or commercial age verification. And I don't know the exact standards by which those are defined. I think they are defined in Florida law. I think commercial age verification has to do with what other industry standards are doing. But you put them in this awkward spot where either they kind of have to do what they already do now, which most social media sites, because I think there's like federal laws that are saying if you're 13 or younger, or you have to be at least 13 or whatever, to have a social media as we're site. I think there are federal laws in place, and this just would bump that up to 14, I guess. It also means that a parent could request that their kids' data be deleted or whatever. But the problem is you put this incumbency on the sites to either have a more robust way of determining that, which I don't know that there is unless you get into those privacy violations, other than asking, are you 14 years old, right? And so if you go beyond that, you violate the privacy. And if you don't go beyond that, then it seems like you're just setting these websites up to have all kinds of headaches legally, where a kid lies about their age and then someone just brings an argument to say, hey, they knowingly did this, when maybe the kid uploaded a photo that would be like, say, oh, well, clearly they're not not older than 14 or whatever. There's just a lot of potential liabilities here that is just a headache for business. And again, it's not that I think that these social media companies are the best in the world, but I do think that you're giving government power over an entire sector, over an entire business space. And what ends up happening in many cases is that the businesses change for the worse. There's I'll say it again. I loved hearing the quote from before. There's no bad policy that government intervention can't make worse. And so to me, it's one of those things where every time the government has been involved with regulating social media in one way or the other, the direct outcomes have been noticeably and almost wholly worse for the user side experience.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't have much more to add to it. It's just that whenever you put the burden of regulation on businesses, like everything usually does get much more like terrible, because this is essentially just a decree, right? Like it's not like the government saying, "Hey, we're going to fund you company to enforce this. It's like, no, we're passing this now. Company, you have to figure out how to enforce it. A rule that they never wanted to enforce in the first place, and as well as a rule that the general populace probably didn't necessarily want either. Maybe they did in spirit, but you know what I'm trying to say. And
Yeah.
it's like these companies, if there really was like a need for this, the public outcry, in order for it to truly be effective, it would have to come from the public. And by public, I mean like each individual being like, hey, we're not going to let our kids use this, or we're going to boycott or do whatever we're going to do. The government doing it is not actually going to lead to, like, as we've always talked about, more virtuous people. It's just going to be, even with the government verified ID, it's like you're saying, it's bad for like you're going to have to, if you're going to use these services, you got to put your government ID in. But it's like, yeah, as if kids aren't going to figure out how to get around that either, right?
Yeah.
Like that's just kind of the nature of youth to do that. The way that you solve for youth being the way that they are is not by saying the government is going to handle it, but by saying that the community is going to handle it and create virtuous people, because youth are going to youth. That's just what they're going to do.
Yeah, well, I mean, just look at in China when they regulated video game time and they require government IDs. The reality is that kids found ways around it using AI images, or they just had their parents scan their IDs.
Yep.
So like, I'm not saying that's a 1-for-1 of what could happen here, but it's not, you never are gonna get the desired outcome, and you're always gonna get the non-desired unintended consequences.
Yes. Yep.
At best you get a little bit of the thing you want and all of the bad thing, and at worst you get almost none of the thing you want and all of the bad thing. There's no scenario where you don't get the bad stuff.
Yep.
Okay, we'll move on to the next take here. This one comes from Michael White for Arkansas. He tweets, "Governments don't have rights. You do. Rights that precede government, and thus government's only job is to secure them. Your preeminent right is self-ownership. To suggest government supersedes that right is to say they have a greater claim to your life than you do. They don't. No one does." All right, what do you make of the take?
This is a good take. It's I saw another tweet exchange last year that was basically, it was like quiz time, like what rights does the Constitution grant, of these, and it listed like the right to self-defense, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and things like that. And obviously conservatives and libertarians and stuff all answered. It's like, oh yeah, it grants all of those. It's like wrong. Like it doesn't. It just acknowledges those, right? It acknowledges that you have the right to that. And this is kind of the like get the right answer is a symptom of like public schooling, and which is administered by the government, and has a natural inclination to instilling as much power and prestige and like rights that they have upon into the minds of the impressionable youth. And so the government, and if like we've talked about this before, but when they were writing the Declaration of Independence and everything, they said that these rights are self-evident. Like they didn't even have to provide any other argument beyond that. These are self-evident. We don't have to provide an argument. We're going to take these rights because they exist for us. And so the same way that the individuals at the time were telling the ruling government that like, nope, you've denied us these rights that are above and more sovereign than you are, and we're going to take them. That same thing applies to us today with our current government.
Absolutely. It's funny because I was just talking about this with my wife, because she got jury duty, and we were just kind of talking through all the different kind absurdities of the system as it works. Now, let me start by saying, as far as the legal system goes, there may be problems with a jury format, but I do think that there is merit to it as well, just in the sense that an unbiased selection of people, having multiple people, having deliberation, those can all be good things, and they have their arguments and merit. But the thing that gets me, of course, is the mandatory nature of it. And we were just talking about how it is crazy that the government can tell you that you have to put your life on hold and you have to do this thing, or else they can put out a warrant for your arrest. We were talking about, okay, what if, your job, maybe it covers a week if you're lucky, but they're not required to pay you, which again, we don't think the government should force them to, but you can be out of your job for weeks because the standby time is 1 week or a full trial, whichever is longer. And this could happen for weeks and weeks and weeks. And then you just don't make money. And then we were also talking about even in the lesser situations. What about families who either they don't have a car or maybe they share a car and both couples work, or maybe the husband works and the wife has duty, or vice versa, or something. And now you're out of your car. And the most insulting thing is that in at least in Washington State, they pay you $10 a day. Some areas maybe 25, but it's like $10 a day. We're like, at that point, it's almost just insulting. It's like they think, oh, it's not slavery if we give you pittance.
Like
But
that in Washington, that's like not even enough to buy a coffee.
no, I mean, we were talking how you would definitely want to make sure that people, you'd have to find a balance of some kind. But if you were doing this at a market rate, you would do something that would make people incentivized to want to do it. You'd probably have to set a market rate that wouldn't overly encourage people to try to get their name in a draft more than once, and be there for the wrong reasons. But
Well,
even
yeah.
even still, the incentive, if you do a blind pick or something, but then you create the option and the incentive for it to be a reasonable market value, you would have the equilibrium. And so all of this to say that that's precluded, or all of this uh, assumption of that the government gets to tell you you have to do this precludes the idea that the government owns you and you don't have the right to your life. The government does, which is just, it's crazy that we just kind of put up with that.
Like the libertarian and anarcho-capitalist like government philosophy is, and the philosophy of human action is an acknowledgement that these rights exist, right? Like in that jury scenario that you're talking about, it's like, because we all like deep in us know that we have the right to self-ownership, and at least we act like we do because we make choices and trade-offs in our day-to-day. When you get called up for jury duty and you have the trade-off of like, well, like based on my life, I have one car in my family, and yeah, my job can't fire me, but I'm not going to make the same amount of money. Like maybe I'm going to give during the jury interviews, some bad answers so that I'm not actually, even if I am technically probably one of the best people to like give the most fair evaluation of this case, I'm incentivized to not do that. And then if you swing the other way, right? Like you're saying, if you make it so that it's, maybe they pay you $250 a day or something like that. Like then prosecutors and other folks are incentivized to maybe not bring as many cases to court and to settle. And so all of these things, like when you don't acknowledge that there are rights and that we act like we have them, the ability for self-determination, you make these different types of calculuses and calls that create so much imbalance that you can't actually get to the best outcome or the most fair outcome. But when you act in such a way that lets the market act for itself and lets humans act on their own, then you are more likely to get to that fair outcome. But it does require a giving up of control. And if there's anything we've ever known, right, the government does not ever do that.
Yeah, of course not. And again, let's just zoom out from this whole discussion. If you're saying, well, we need this system to okay, just zoom out and at least recognize that if that is your claim, that in order to have the function of society, if we have to have this set up in the way that we do, and that's the only option, then you are admitting that the government has more right to your body than you do. Because when it comes down to it, if you said, no, I have a trip scheduled, I cannot be here, and the government said, nope, you've been randomly selected for jury duty, you have to be here, the government wins. They own you more than you do, right? That's the crazy thing you have to admit if you're saying, well, that's the only way it works, and so that's the price we pay for a civilized society. You're saying the price we pay for a civilized society essentially is handing over our ownership to the government, which is kind of crazy to admit that. And hopefully, rather than make you think, oh, I guess the government does own us, hopefully that's enough to make people think, wait, maybe I need to reevaluate, and I'd have a different perspective on this.
What it's I can't remember the like excerpt it's from, but Michael Malice's The Anarchist Handbook, one of them talks about like if for a voluntary contract to like be in place, like there has to be a clause where both sides can choose to break it or exit out of it if one doesn't live up to it. And it's like, okay, so the government routinely does not live up to its side of the deal. In like in a contract where both have rights and both people have equal right, and they've come to a mutual understanding, and we're born into it, so we don't even come to a mutual understanding. But let's just say we're the first citizens of this country. The second the country didn't uphold its end of the bargain, should be allowed to at least enforce some element of the clause that penalizes them for not enforcing their side of the bargain, or you're allowed to break the contract and leave it. But we don't have any of that type of right. And so it shows you who actually is the dominant partner in this, and that it's not actually a contract in any way. The social contract, as people like to call it, is not actually a thing. It like you're saying, it is, for lack of a better term, slavery, right? And it might not be to the slavery as that we've seen like in the 1800s or something like that, but the same principle stands, that someone has more of a right to your body than you do, and that's, as I think we'd all agree, is wrong.
Absolutely. All right. Our next take here comes from James Lindsay, who's good on some things and so bad on others. And I'm afraid we've got a little bit of the latter here. So it's an interesting take, but it's not I wouldn't say I agree with it. So James Lindsay tweets, Christ is king, as it is declared, is a sophisticated and manipulative dialectical trap like Black Lives Matter, and Christians are being baited into it by a few public figures and a band of antisocial troublemakers, likely led by a Fed. Christians are expected to agree with the sentiment because it is, in a way, a cornerstone belief of their religion. They're often expected to participate in the refrain as well. Just like Black Lives Matter, it's something undeniable for Christians, but also manipulative. Christ is King has more than one meaning, of course, and one of them is a very Catholic, dominionist, integralist meaning that is, in fact, intentionally hostile towards Jews. And the people weaponizing this article of faith know that. It's bad faith thinking, it's clever. There are many verses Christians should pay attention to here that insist things about wolves in sheep's clothing, false teachers, taking the Lord's name in vain, and professing to be wise and clever while being fools, but the social pressure from brothers is high. A likely response to me pointing this out, parentheses, again, and like the last time, will be to be swarmed with attacks that I hate Christians, together with puerile demands that I bend the knee and confess that Christ is king, weaponizing that against me with Christians when I don't. There will also be a lot of anti-Semitism in the mix because the operators are operators and their useful idiots can't control themselves. Know them by their fruits. Just know it's a deliberate manipulation, and at least some of the people doing it know that and are playing it. All right, this comes from James Lindsay, who is, of course, I think an atheist, if not agnostic.
Former Christian, though, right?
I'm not sure. It's possible. But
either way,
I
mean, if he's a former Christian, it's very disappointing. If he's not, then there's a little bit of grace that can be given, I suppose. But there's a lot to say about this. This is definitely an interesting way to kind of frame the Christ is King debate. And I don't know if we provide much context for listeners, but like this kind of kicked off when Candace Owens from the Daily Wire, or formerly of the Daily Wire, got let go, and mainly because she was having some like run-ins with various rabbis of the Jewish faith about specifically Palestine and the war in Gaza. And the Daily Wire decided to sever ties with her because she wasn't really towing the company line, which is headed up by Ben Shapiro, who's very, very pro turn Gaza into a parking lot, unfortunately. And so, Christ is King. Like, one of the things that, a Christian will understand, like Jesus literally talks about in the Bible that he didn't come to bring peace, but to bring a sword, right? That he was going to divide mother against brother and against son versus father, all these different things, because he came with the truth, right? And the Jews decided to reject Christ as their king. Like the Jews are still in waiting for their Messiah, according to the Abrahamic religion. They believe that he hasn't shown up yet, and they believe that Jesus was not, maybe a prophet at best, and definitely at worst something bad, and that he is going to be in hell and everything like that. And so it's Christ is King is cornerstone to the Christian faith. And yes, it is actually hostile to the Jewish faith, but it's not hostile in an anti-Semitic way. It's hostile in the way that it's hostile to every other faith out there that doesn't proclaim that Christ is King, right? What Jews will try and say is like, well, you're trying to say that like we're not God's chosen people anymore or anything like that. We're saying, no, like you and everyone else can be God's chosen people. That's what Jesus came to do. He came to, according to the Christian faith, came to open up and tear the veil so that not only could the Jews be part of God's family, but so could the Greek and the Gentile. And but through him, who is the way, the truth, and the life, and the only way to God. No one comes to the Father but through him. And so any Jew who does reject Christ as King is not actually part of God's chosen people anymore. No more so than, James Lindsay, who's an atheist or agnostic, or someone who practices Hinduism, or is part of the Islamic faith or anything like that. So yeah, I'm sure that there are people that have like spun it to be anti-Semitic, and they mean it in some way, and they tag on to like Christ is King, you what blankety blank 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 at the end of it. But the majority of folks and the actual meaning of it is not anti-Semitic, and sure, it could be twisted in some form or fashion. And if the powers that be decide to make it a racist saying or something like that, then I don't know what we're going to do about that. But it doesn't mean that it's not true, right? It's Christ is King can be true, and it's also true that it's not anti-Semitic any more than it's anti-Hindu or anti anything else, right? It's saying that there is one way to the eternal life and to good things. So yeah, it is. That's where it's kind of difficult, right? It is hostile, but it's not uniquely hostile to the Jews.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I think that the thing that makes me so annoyed here is he's acting as though the origin of Christ as King is in this particular movement of anti-Semitism. And there's a couple things I would say to that. The first is that unlike Black Lives Matter, Christ is King has been a foundational truth that is not just, in a sense, a cornerstone. No, it is a cornerstone. It is one of the cornerstone beliefs of Christianity. Black Lives Matter is a true, separated from the movement, is a true statement, but it's not like it was sung out before that was made into the movement, right? It's not like Black Lives Matter was a common phrase that was said, and then this group came over and sort of co-opted it. That's, I think, one of the key fundamental differences here. Because my thought is, okay, if there are people that are trying to specifically harass Jews with this Christ is King messaging and use this as a dog whistle, well, then the logical response is drown it out with everyone saying Christ is King and not in a dog whistle way. A dog whistle is only useful if you're actually signaling to other people what you mean by that. But if the overwhelming chorus of people are chanting Christ is King because, they're not saying all Jews are the root cause of the problems of the world, but they're saying it because, Christ is King, then your dog whistle isn't going to work very well. And so that's the thing that I think that really gets me annoyed, is that James Lindsay's trying to, and then he does the thing where in the last response where he pokes the hornet's nest, and then he's like, oh, look, they're all mad, I must be getting something right. And it's like, no, you just said stupid things, like, of course people are going to be mad at you. And so he's going to act like he's justified in this because there are people who say things in an anti-Semitic way with that as a label. But you could make the same argument about anything. Again, I'm going to quote once again one of my favorite St. Augustine quotes, which is, never judge a philosophy by its abuse. In the same way that I do not think that, oh my goodness, I don't know, Joel Osteen, prosperity gospel guy, said God loves you. So we can't say God loves you because he uses that as a pathway to the prosperity gospel, which is a false gospel. Therefore, we can't say that. That's stupid. And he's doing the thing where it's kind of like the reverse problem I have, where he's critiquing something and then saying, you shouldn't say these things. Then, we respond and say, hey, don't try to control my speech. And he retreats and saying, I'm not telling you what to say or not to say. I'm just saying, like I'm just trying to inform you. He had that in some other tweets where he was acting like, oh man, look at all these touchy Christians. I'm not telling them, I'm just trying to inform them. No. By saying that you're being duped, you're being manipulated, don't say this, by saying this thing, you're an idiot. You are telling people what to and what to not say. And that's a very disingenuous take from him. So I hate this take because he gets things wrong. He misquotes verses and acts so condescending about all of it, as though he's just this intellectual who knows this better than you and you're just the blind idiot. No. You need to look at the at the meme chart of the bell curve, where at the bottom is someone saying Christ is King with the low information, the midwit, no, it's a dialectical phrase that's being used for Marxist and anti-Semitic ends, and then at the top end, Christ is King, because he's just trying to spin what some bad faith actors are doing into the whole narrative, and that's just wrong. And truth should be declared and drown out the misuses of the truth.
Is he trying to say that like this the trap is that, well, if I say Christ is king, therefore, you know, I have to hate Jews? Is that what
I
he's
think
saying they're trying to get pulled into?
I think that he's trying to say that basically declaring Christ as king leads you into a movement of anti-Semitic people who are trying to be hostile towards Judaism specifically.
Huh.
I think that's the point he's trying to make here. In the same way that,
It's
for
taking a
instance,
long time then, man.
yeah,
That's like, dude,
I know,
yeah,
I
yeah.
know, I know. And here's the thing: I do acknowledge anti-Semitism exists online from people who will call themselves Christians. It
Sure.
is bad and rough. Again, that doesn't mean that that is either the majority case or the phrase is now ruined and tainted. And you know, you're, if anything, you're surrendering. Yeah, you know, he hates wokeism. You're surrendering to the woke mob if you let them take over the phrase from its original meaning and truth. I think he calls himself a liberal. So you know, should you know people who under the name liberal are doing DEI policy? Should he run away from that term and say, "Oh man, you're being a useful idiot, James Lindsay. You're calling yourself a liberal. Now you have to subscribe to DEI stuff." I mean, that's kind of when you take out all of the wordy fluff and misapplied verses. That's kind of the argument he's making, which is really, really, really stupid.
Yeah. What's kind of rough about this whole thing though is, like I was saying, it Christianity is at odds with
Yes,
everything.
yeah,
And especially Judaism in some ways, right? Because they were the first people to receive and then reject the Messiah. And so like I've never really particularly been a fan of like this Judeo-Christian like framework that people talk about. Because there's like, no, Christianity is Christianity and Judaism is Judaism. And yes, you can maybe reference like the Abrahamic religions and like how there's certain key aspects of like moral frameworks that arise from a monotheistic religion, but Christianity couldn't be any more different than Judaism, and it is at odds with it, just as it's been at odds with every other religion that does not proclaim Christ as king. But the thing is, it's like that's an argument for that, like Christ as king is not uniquely anti-Semitic, because we've been saying that for 2,000 years, and we have acknowledged that Christianity is the opposite of Judaism because it does declare and recognize that a Messiah has come. And yes, there have been little instances and big instances of anti-Semitism. But like if it hasn't happened within the past 2,000 years, to use this as justification for it, and like you're saying, St. Augustine, judge it by the actual philosophy. It's like, yeah, the actual philosophy doesn't call for that, right? Like if you read any about Paul, like Paul literally talks about in his letters that he wishes he could go and trade places and go to hell so that his Jewish brothers and sisters would come to know Christ. So core to the Christian faith is like, yes, this is at odds with Judaism, but it's at odds in an effort to save and to bring them into a more fulfilling and eternal life that is meant to be lived, not to destroy them. And so,
right. Well, and
um,
that's the whole point of the new covenant, right? Is that
yes,
it expands. It's not, oh, the Jews are no longer welcome. It's that everyone is welcome. And so
yes,
yeah, yeah. So like that's the other aspect of this is in the way that Christianity is hostile to other beliefs and to Judaism. It's not hostile to Jews, and that's a distinction, right? It's hostile to Judaism, not Jews. Uh, the the distinction, of course, being ethnically the realities there, right? So if you are a Jewish person in faith and you are rejecting Christ, then of course it's hostile to that belief and to you. But if you
yes,
are a Jewish person by ethnicity or even by faith who's open to believing, the covenant is open to you too. And you know, Paul says there is neither Greek nor Roman nor Jew nor Gentile nor man nor woman in the faith. Like it's open to all. It's an expansive, better covenant. And so, you know, that's the other thing he tries to say is like, oh, you know, he asks like, are the Jews God's chosen people? Like trying to do this gotcha because American Christianity is really bad about understanding historical Protestantism or historic, you know, Catholicism or Orthodoxy and the faith there. And it's, you know, the Zionist American church in many cases are like, but they are the chosen people, and it's like, no, they were the chosen people until the covenant was expanded, and then that
yes.
opened to everyone, and they are no longer the chosen people
The
because it is
only they're no longer the only
right, right,
chosen
exactly,
people.
yeah, and so it's kind of ridiculous, and I think that really the reason why people hate Christ is King, not James Lindsay here. I think James Lindsay, rather than us being duped into the DEI false trap of, you know, identitarian politics that's winding you into anti-Semitism. I think he's being duped by the people who don't want people to have a religion other than the state. That is the pure and simple, because when religion is your thing, as it would be for anyone who believes it, it is the truth. It's not just our thing; it's the truth. Um, when that is apparent to you and you see through that, the government owning you becomes a lot less of a thing that you can tolerate. Because if the government asks me to do something against my faith, of course, the reality, the truth, takes precedent over whatever the government says. So that's why government types hate the proclamation Christ is king, because they want to be king. They want to
Yes.
demand those edicts. And James Lindsay, I think, is foolishly playing into their hands.
And that is a tale
Again,
as old as time that
and that
the
is
government hates.
definitely led by a Fed, not likely, definitely led by the Fed.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Next take comes from Maj Toure. He tweets, "We don't suspend our foundational constitutional principles because of a crisis. Advocating for that during the illegal immigrant crisis because some of them may have guns is the same as advocating lockdowns and forced masks and jabs in the 2020 crisis. We don't abandon human rights because it's an emergency right now. Government and media will always make the emergencies to justify suspending your rights. Have y'all been paying attention since 9/11 or not?"
Is this about the is this about the illegal immigrants being allowed to have guns? Is
I
that
think so. I think it has to do with gun rights, with taking from immigrants and things like that.
so I really like Maj Touré's like overall take in a vacuum. Like this I do. Like it's very bad to suspend foundational principles in an emergency because then they will create emergencies to suspend your foundational constitutional principles. I'm not really sure where I fall on the illegal immigrant ruling where they or the ruling where illegal immigrants are allowed to keep their weapons and things like that. Um because it seems to me that like, okay, if we don't, in absence of only there being private property, then we have a state and we have borders, and that's kind of like the best approximation to private property that we've got. And technically it's public, and you would never let someone who has not been invited onto your lawn come there and then also be like, oh yeah, by the way, like you have a legal right to have whatever you want to have on your person after you've come onto my lawn without my permission. So it's like I support the right of them to have their weapons in the country that they're coming from, but I don't necessarily support them being able to come over here uninvited and bring whatever they want. Like that just seems kind of silly to me. But I'm open to having my mind being changed. A lot of folks within our philosophy are kind of divided on that,
Yeah, and I
as
think
evidenced by this.
I know. I was gonna say, I think rightfully so. This is probably one of the most back and forth things I've thought in my head. I don't know that I land on a specific side. I do think that the problem is the moment you give them the right to take away the guns, you just give them more reason and more excuse to take away defense from people. But on the same hand, you have the government that's refusing to enforce its one, job of protection through border security. Like that is the only functional role that in that monopoly space, basically. That there's no private alternatives to allowing or disallowing people to come into a neighborhood, to a space. And so it's one of those things where I think that I think in general, I probably would err on the side of it is probably better that they ruled this way. However, um, it's now incumbent on the government to do everything it can to secure that border and to secure people in those neighborhoods and to allow people in those areas where immigrants are flooding to have self-defense, to have protection, to hire private security if it need be, to have those weapons coming in. And so it's one of those things where it's I think I would sympathize with someone on either side of this particular case. I just tend to think that in the long term, it's probably more harmful to have the precedent of here's the situation in which the government gets to take your guns away, because that will always expand versus we do have a dangerous situation right now. Hopefully we have enough tools in the time being where communities and individuals are empowered to keep themselves safe. The problem is you have the worst of both worlds in many cases with the government cracking down on both. And so I don't know. To me, it's kind of like a darned if you do, darned if you don't situation. I would tend to agree with Maj here, I think. However, I do think that it's one of those things that's easier said than done when you have people pouring into your streets with weapons, that aren't from here and that aren't necessarily the best they're not good faith actors.
Yeah. I think that it's like I guess it's like your opinion on like open versus closed borders with the country, like where you fall upon that in the libertarian philosophy that determines it. Because I mean, I guess if you, to me, like logically, it follows. If I believe that in absence of it being, like I said, total private property, then there is a state, then there is a border, and it is quote unquote public property. Therefore, it does enforce some sort of property rights. Like when you break the like a person's property rights, you do forfeit some level of your human right? Like you don't necessarily have the right to exist in that space. Like you will need to be removed from that space if they deem you not to be, like, not to be desired to be there. And if you continue to refuse, like, it can escalate to you forfeiting your right to, live. And so it's like these people are breaking the law coming over, and it might not be a law that we're like happy that exists, or it's executed by a state that we're happy that exists. But like, if we're looking at just as like the United States being one big, yard, you got people coming over, and they are, regardless of whether they are, innocent or they don't have bad intentions or whatever, like they have come over in a way that we can't tell whether their intentions are good or not. And therefore you do, like in that instance, you give up some ability to like maintain those things until it's like verified that like you are supposed to be here, or that we do want you here, right? And then once you are allowed to be here, it's like if I had you, Donnie, come over, and you were I was like, hey, don't bring that silly Android phone with you. Or what, do you have a Windows phone or an Android phone, or what is it now?
Windows Phone's long dead. Yeah, I do. I am running Android.
Okay. Yeah, don't bring that silly Android phone over here. I don't want you to bring that over or whatever. I'm sorry, I need to rewind. You come over and I'm like, oh man, like you're on my property. Like I invited you and you have your Android phone. It's like, well, I'm gonna just kind of deal with it. But if you came on to my property and you were like being kind of a jerk, and I didn't know you from Adam, and you had your Android phone, like I'd be within my rights to be like, hey, like I don't, like, you could stay, but I don't want you to have that Android phone right with you. It's just kind of like that's both levels of like decency as well as property rights being executed there. And so, but this also could be kind of it's a really interesting trick, right? Because it's like you get people to say like, oh well, there are certain instances where people can have their weapons taken away from them, right? And it's like, well, yes, but no. Not when people are living where they want to live and have a right to live, then no, you're not allowed to take their weapons away from them. But if they're intruding upon someone else's state, or someone else's property, then no, you're not allowed to. Here in Washington, like there are a lot of places that have signs up, private businesses that say, hey, we don't want to have weapons in here. They can't legally force you to not have weapons in their establishment, but they can tell you, hey, we don't want to associate with you, right? If they found out. So if you
Right.
brought a gun into an establishment and they found out that you had it, even though you're legally allowed to have that gun on you and you're technically legally allowed to be anywhere you want with it, that doesn't mean that someone has to let you remain there if you have it. I've not had that happen to me, obviously, or anything like that. But like you could have a private company say, hey, you're allowed to stay, but if you're going to have that weapon on you, then you have to go. And that's kind of how I choose to view the whole border thing.
Yeah, I would say that that's probably the closest thing there is, I would double down on the idea, or I would say that if the state could provide the private property and the private ownership arguments for this, when the illegals are coming, if they're going into a neighborhood, for instance, the idea of public roads and stuff is where this in many cases gets so messed up, because if you're on a public sidewalk, you're not on someone's property per se. But I feel like the property owners surrounding there should be able to say, hey, no, like you don't get to do this. The other view that you could take on this is that by crossing over the border illegally, they are committing an act of aggression with when you are carrying a weapon,
Yes.
because it's an uninvited movement into non-invited territory with something that is dangerous and threatening. And so I could see that justification too, because there are situations where we would say it makes sense that a response is justified. So for instance, disarming someone and removing their weapon is justified when they are attacking you with that weapon, or they are coming at you with a weapon in an aggressive manner. That would be an act of aggression that you could respond to with aggression. And so you could view it that way as well. And so I do think that there is merit to that side of the argument as well. but I also just slightly worried of just the idea of, again, giving more precedence for gun removal, saying the government has the authority to determine when something is or isn't a threat, and the ever expanding scope of that. So yeah, it's kind of one of those things where it's a little bit out of our hands. I don't know that having an opinion on this issue one way or the other, makes an effective difference in advocacy or anything, because it really was a court decision, unfortunately. But I think that the best case solution is to immediately, have the government stop filling the monopoly space of border control, really, or actually do its job there. And in lieu of that, allowing the private communities, with people to say, hey, these people aren't invited, we are going to disarm them. I think that makes a lot more sense, giving that local control to where the people are, when they have them. But that's also easier said than done. So.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, is that it, or do we have one more? I think that might be it.
I think that's it.
Okay, yep. That's the show. Well, thanks so much for hanging out with us. We appreciate it. Leave a like and share this with a friend if you enjoyed it, and we'll catch you on the next one.